So, welcome everyone. We are so glad to see you today. This webinar is the fourth of five that are focused on planning tools to support Great Lakes coastal resilience. Today, we're talking about putting all those tools together and also putting them to work by integrating our resilience plans and our implementation projects. My name is Leah DeMichelle. I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Michigan Association of Planning and the Michigan Coastal Management Program of the Department of the Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, fondly known here as EAGLE. All the webinars in this series are being recorded. Links are provided on the webpage that's shown on your screen right now. You also, while you're there, can get access to other helpful resilience planning resources from that page, including the Coastal Management Program's planning guide and its 6-video series, which is just terrific. No matter who you are, you'll learn something from that video series. We have today saved the whole last third of this time together for our questions and discussion. So we're really looking forward to that. While the presentations are going on, we would love it if you'd put your questions, your observations in the chat for that so we have them ready to go. And then finally, we have one administrative item before I introduce our speakers. This webinar series is funded through a Coastal Management Program grant, and that grant requires a local match contribution, which you can help us meet by giving us just permission to count the time that you spend on this webinar, and we would be very grateful if you would do that. So I'm going to launch a poll here, and you should see one on your screen with the following question. Or the following statement: I give permission to the Michigan Association of Planning to apply my time participating in this webinar toward the volunteer match requirement for EAGLE Grant CLA 609-003. MAP will use the Zoom participant report from this webinar to document the match. So you can just click yes, I give permission, unless you are a federal employee, in which case you can skip this, or click no, because we can't count your time because that's double dipping. So I will give you just a couple of seconds to agree to that, please. And then I will just go ahead and end this poll. We will send it again at the end of the session. In case you missed your opportunity, we will give you another one. So on to today's speakers. My wonderful colleague, Wendy Ramson, is the Director of Programs and Outreach here at the Michigan Association of Planning, where she manages our grant initiatives that support communities that are planning for sustainability and resilience, including this longtime partnership with EAGLE. Before Wendy was MAP's coastal expert and also our shepherd of student and emerging planners. She served as the planning manager and everything up to it for the city of Ann Arbor, which is a city that has a lot of plans and does a lot of things. So she is definitely the right person to help us align all of our good planning work and then turn it into action. Wendy is joined today by Hillary Taylor, Assistant Planning Director for Coastal Emmett County, Michigan, where she has been delighted to return after working with numerous communities out west in Wyoming, Washington, and Montana over her 14 years in the planning profession. Emmett County was actually an initial pilot community for EAGLE's Coastal Leadership Academy back in 2019 to 2020. So the community adopted a coastal and climate vulnerability assessment, comprehensive plan, and then shortly thereafter is when Hillary arrived with her professional focus on updating zoning ordinances to better adopt those plans. So she is here today to tell us that story. So one more time, we will ask you to mute your mic and use the chat, and then Wendy will take it away.
Right. Thank you, Leah, and welcome everyone. We hope there's a lot of content here today. Some of it is kind of wonky, as it were, for planners, but hopefully you can take away some tools that will help you in your practice. So today we're going to focus on to better coordinate our resilience planning to be more effective and to have more effective implementation of our resilience efforts. And if the slide would advance. There we go. Before I start discussing how our plans can be integrated to improve resilience, I'd like to explore why resiliency should be in our plans in the first place. So if you think about it, when we kick off a planning effort, we often start with a SWOT analysis. So strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. If we are aspiring to make our communities more resilient, in other words, more able to resist, accommodate, or bounce back from potential hazards, we need to identify those threats and then understand the community's vulnerabilities and develop ways to address the threats. This illustration on this slide was taken from the recent resilience assessment done by the City of Marquette, and it highlights a variety of hazards or threats to their community well-being. So whether that's environmental injustice, whether it is buildings that are failing, whether it's flooding and flooding impacts, every community is going to have threats that they're going to need to deal with. If we think of threats common to coastal communities, these include things like lake level variability here in the Great Lakes, sea level rise for coastal communities on the Salt Coast, shoreline erosion, damage to buildings, loss of wetlands and habitat, which impacts the ecology of the area, tourism impacts, infrastructure damage, and legacy industrial contamination, which is something that many communities, particularly along the Lake Huron coast, deal with. So incorporating resilience thinking into our plans can help communities anticipate these threats and provide guidance for addressing them. Over the next few slides, I'll highlight some typical examples or typical plans that communities create and point out some ways each can support their resilience efforts. One way to address resiliency in our planning world is to create a sustainability or resilience plan to deal with anticipated threats and hazards and guide the community to become more resilient. For those of you who have been through the Resilient Michigan Plan Review process conducted by the Land Information Access Association, you're already familiar with the components of a sustainability or resilience plan. It typically starts by looking at community demographics, current land uses, and historical hazard events. That information is then paired with future climate projections to develop a vulnerability assessment that identifies geographic areas of concern. So for instance, in this slide, the darker portion of the slide represents risk of buildings that are at risk, sensitive areas that are at risk along the Detroit River. So recommendations for mitigating or adapting to these anticipated shocks to the system can be included in the resilience plan. Many sustainability or resilience plans are created as standalone plans, like this one from the City of Trenton, because they are fairly technical in their nature. But ideally, this information, or at least the takeaways, should be incorporated into the community's master plan as well. Almost every municipality has a comprehensive land use plan, often called the master plan, which guides the municipality's efforts to accomplish the community's vision for the future. It is also the basis for the zoning ordinance, which is one of the tools to implement the plan's recommendations. The Michigan Planning Enabling Act requires a municipality to have a master plan if it has a zoning ordinance. The statute also requires that the plan be reviewed every 5 years to keep it current. The comprehensive plan is an obvious choice to incorporate resilience goals and objectives, given its community-wide focus and its statutory importance, at least here in Michigan. Listed here are the basic components you'll find in a comp plan. I'm sure you are all very familiar with these, most of which are related to land use, although the Michigan statute allows the plan to address other areas, for instance, transportation, civic design, public utilities, recreation, health, resource use, and interestingly, the state statute talks about safety from dangers, so that's a great alignment here. Resiliency goals and recommendations can be incorporated into the comprehensive plan as a separate chapter or integrated throughout, and there are examples of both that work very well. Another place that resiliency planning occurs is in hazard mitigation plans, also known as all hazards plans. These plans typically include risk assessments and scenario development to anticipate future hazards. The risk assessments often rely on information about past disasters and known hazards to look to the future, but as we all know, those aren't going to necessarily inform us about the future. So more and more, these hazard plans are looking to incorporate climate forecasts where they can. These plans are helpful in identifying potential shocks to the community that they need to understand, prepare for, and recover from. An adopted hazard mitigation plan is required for many types of Federal Emergency Management Agency or FEMA grants. In most areas of Michigan, the hazard mitigation plan is created and updated at the county level, but localities certainly can produce their own. Either way, having your community's mitigation projects included in the plan makes them eligible for FEMA grants through the Michigan State Police, which is a big plus. Many of you are probably familiar with parks and recreation plans as standalone documents that municipalities develop, often to get money as a part of the Michigan Department of Natural Resources grants. These plans must follow the MDNR template, which looks much like the format of master plans. To be eligible for project funding, the plan must be updated every 5 years. So that plan includes a general inventory of recreational assets, goals and objectives, and an action plan. So it's really a condensed version of the master plan. Parks and recreation plans offer a really great opportunity to incorporate economic, social, and environmental resiliency. For example, by incorporating nature-based tourism to support the local economy, providing community-wide access to recreational opportunities to support your community's equity goals, and perhaps acquiring land for shoreline protection and green infrastructure goals. In addition to municipality, I'm going to be on that word through this whole webinar. I'm so sorry. Municipality-wide plans. Many communities create sub-area or district plans to achieve specific development or redevelopment goals. These focus on a smaller geographic area, but they still need to align with the larger community-wide vision. District plans offer the benefit of being more focused on implementation. So incorporating resilience recommendations here might have more immediate visibility and impact than if they were housed in the master plan. A capital improvement plan, or CIP, identifies and prioritizes the community's anticipated public infrastructure needs over the next 6 years. While the tendency is to treat the CIP narrowly as perhaps an asset management program or merely a budget document, it's an important way to implement priority infrastructure goals from your master plan. And that is why Michigan's Planning Act actually assigns responsibility for creating CIPs to the Planning Commission. Examples of the ways in which a CIP can be used to support resiliency objectives include things like relocating at-risk roads, acquiring land for flood protection, incorporating green infrastructure into the stormwater system, and maybe even setting up resilience hubs for sheltering populations during heat events or snowstorms. Like resiliency plans, climate and environmental planning initiatives can be standalone as part of the master plan. Many of these plans have a technical or engineering focus. So for instance, greenhouse gas reduction really does get into some very technical analysis. And they're often created by departments and agencies outside of the community planning orbit. Fortunately, by the nature of their mission, these plans can provide a great way for the community to get involved and to make progress on their overall resiliency goals when they're linked to the master plan. Finally, it's important to remember that many municipalities participate in planning efforts at the county and regional level, or in larger scale multi-jurisdictional efforts such as economic development and watershed plans. All of these plans offer the opportunity to expand that local resilience effort to the larger region for more impact, and vice versa. You've heard the old saying, some communities don't plan to fail, they fail to plan. This tends to make us planners feel a bit self-satisfied, right? Well, oops. What happens when we have a lot of plans? Because we can sure create a whole lot of plans. So Leah's going to launch a poll here for you all to take a look at. There are two questions. The first one is, how many plans do you have in your community? Thinking of the whole list that I went through, how many do you think deal with the social and physical and economic recommendations for the community? And you can include county and regional plans as well. So why don't you weigh in here? And then for those of you who are looking at that second question, if you scroll down, how many of these plans do you think actually mention resilience or address resilience? So two polls here. Take a moment to think. How many plans and how many of these plans mention resilience?
I think we've heard from about half of us, so we'll give us another second.
Okay.
Count them up on your fingers.
I know.
I know.
Do a little inventory in your head. Well, this is super interesting. I was expecting maybe in the smaller communities that there would be lower numbers, and there are a few in the 1 and 2 and 3 range, but wow, all these in the 6+ range for,
Okay.
for
And
the array.
so we
And
can,
then, go ahead, Leah.
yep. And now we'll share.
So, think about this in the context of what we're talking about today. All of these plans, how do they align? How do they integrate? We're going to be talking about that. So interestingly, maybe one, maybe 2 or 3 of the plans mention resiliency. So there's a great opportunity for incorporating this into your practice. All right, Leah, we good?
Yes, thank you.
All right. So it's clear there's a lot of planning being done out there. One way to describe this situation is that communities rely on a network of plans. On the plus side, a community's network of plans provide 3 important cornerstones. They serve to articulate the community's vision, they set goals, and they guide community development actions and policy decisions. On the minus side, these plans are often created in silos, focusing on very specific issues or time periods, or perhaps technical requirements or geography. The research cited here on the slide has shown that a community's network of plans tend not to be coordinated, resulting in conflicting goals and priorities. As a result, these conflicts can have a negative effect on resilience efforts. Some of the reasons for this include the complexity of the network, that network of plans, the 6, 10, whatever plans, lack of incentives or requirements to coordinate, so those organizational silos, limited staff capacity, we're all very familiar with that, and also the challenge of incorporating climate and hazard projections. So for example, a comprehensive plan or a sub-area plan that prioritizes a waterfront district for economic development may conflict with a recent hazard mitigation plan that calls for limiting development along the shoreline. Prioritizing funding for road or utility infrastructure in this area through the capital improvements plan could create incentives for development in an area that is prone to flooding or erosion. So that is not necessarily what you want to do, but a lot of times there are those competing interests that haven't really been addressed. One solution to these challenges is plan integration, or the process of harmonizing the network of plans to support resilience goals. In 2020, the American Planning Association, in partnership with the University of North Carolina's Coastal Resilience Center, conducted surveys and interviews to explore what planners know about plan integration and its connection to community resilience. They found a general understanding from the planning community about the importance of plan integration, but also an acknowledgement of the lack of capacity and known tools to do this integration effectively. So following up on the survey results, the APA published a planning advisory service memo in 2021 entitled building resilience through plan integration. And for those of you who know that the planning, the APA has a bit of a firewall for documents and all on their website. This is free for download. And you can use this in your community, even if you're not an APA member. The report outlines the benefits of plan integration as minimizing those conflicts and improving consistency between plans, facilitating coordination across scales and geography, and providing a foundation for plans that follow. And ultimately, those benefits will improve resiliency outcomes. When I was preparing for this webinar, I looked through the Michigan DNR Parks and Recreation Guide, and I found a great description of the benefits of plan integration, although it's very specific to parks. Quote, coordinated planning within a community at a regional level and among government agencies, private organizations, businesses, and the public has many potential benefits. This includes better environmental protection, efficiency in providing park and recreation opportunities, increased funding sources, greater potential for tapping into new creative ways of accomplishing recreation goals, enhanced public support for parks, and increased potential for community buy-in for financing through millages and other taxing methods. So that's a whole long laundry list of benefits, but I'm sure this description could potentially be applied to any other planning initiatives as well. So for many communities, you would illustrate their network of plans as these separate circles on the left. Ideally, with plan integration, each of those separate plans would overlap like this lovely Venn diagram on the right. So how do you go from these separate discrete plans, however well-crafted they are, to a network of plans that overlap and work together? In addition, while I'm using the term integration as the goal for a network of plans, we should also think about alignment of plans, especially when it comes to supporting implementation efforts. Another term for this is plan consistency, not as common in Michigan as perhaps in other states that mandate that. But in the ideal world, regional plans would align with local plans, which would align with zoning requirements and development standards on the private development side, and the capital improvement plan and the municipal budget on the public infrastructure side. Providing the community with that line of sight from plans to implementation can help build trust in the planning process and reinforces accountability. The American Planning Association survey I mentioned earlier measured perceptions of planners about the capacity available to their communities to accomplish plan integration. The survey found that while about half of the respondents reported their community prioritizes taking active steps to integrate, coordinate, and align these plans, 71% of respondents were not familiar with any methods for analyzing and assessing the impacts of these local plans on community resilience. So we know we're supposed to do it, but we're not necessarily sure how to do it. Over the next few slides, I will highlight 5 tools that can be used to facilitate plan integration and alignment, starting with the most robust and comprehensive and moving to some that might be more suited to capacity limitations, smaller communities. I'll mention a tool for incorporating equity considerations as well in hazard planning that can be applied to other planning initiatives. So here we go. The first tool is the most comprehensive and also the most involved. The Plan Integration for Resilience Scorecard, I'm going to call it PIRS, P-I-R-S, was developed for the Coastal Resilience Center by Philip Burke and Jamie Masterson at Texas A&M University. This tool and process provides a method for assessing the consistency of local plans as a way to improve community resilience. Here are some of the objectives of the process. The process is meant to identify those conflicts I mentioned within and among planning documents. It's a systematic method, so it's got a methodology for doing all of this and comparing plans. And it also incorporates a spatial aspect. It looks at the spatial distribution of policies and any of their impacts. The goal of this process ultimately is to prioritize future plan updates. So it's not just an exercise to identify the conflicts, it really is a springboard to making changes in the future. It also has some recommendations for how to do that in simple ways. So making adjustments to existing plans. How do you embed and weave these resiliency principles as you go along in an incremental way? It looks to reduce hazard vulnerability at the neighborhood level, so looking at that geographic sub area. And it also talks about equity and implementing the resiliency measures equitably. So at least it's a starting point. It doesn't really provide a whole lot of guidance in that direction, but at least involves identifying social equity issues. And then ultimately, it includes tracking policy implementation, which is really the goal of what we want to do, is make these plans go into an action mode. So the PERS process has 3 discrete steps: preparation, analysis, and plan integration. These steps are laid out in pretty great detail in the PERS guidebook, which is available for no cost at the PERS website. And I believe that Leah is going to be putting in links as we go along so that people can access these easily. The first step in the preparation phase is to form a team of staff that will identify policies in their network of plans. They'll also map planning districts and hazard zones, and then they will work to bring stakeholders into this review process. The broader the involvement, the better. The next step is for the team to conduct a content analysis of the plans and compile lists of goals, objectives, or actions that are potentially applicable to resilience, followed by an inventory of place-specific recommendations. And so this is a very qualitative type of approach. There may be some guiding terminology that you use in a word search or something like that to get started, but ultimately everyone's going to, on this team, is going to have to read the plans and understand what is included in them in order to make this work. Concurrent with the plan inventory, the team creates maps to be cross-referenced with the policy narratives that are identified. So this involves overlapping maps of hazard zones such as floodplains and impervious surface, and overlapping those with the community's planning districts or their census tracts. The data is then all collected between the maps and the narrative, and it's organized in a table format to allow for comparison and scoring. They call this the scorecard. Here's an example of a completed scorecard from one of the pilot communities, Washington, North Carolina, which is located on the Pamlico River off the Atlantic coast. The left column shows the different planning districts identified in the mapping exercise. Across the top are the 4 plans that were consulted in this case: the core land use plan, the comprehensive plan, the hazard mitigation plan, and the parks and recreation plan. In the row below the plans are headings for the columns that overlap, show the overlap between the district and the current hazard zone, in this case, the 100-year floodplain, and the projected hazard zone, which in this case is sea level rise. SLR represents sea level rise. So using the scorecard and the maps, the team assigns scores. So they look at the narrative that they've taken from the inventory. They assign a +1 to indicate a policy that positively affects, that is, reduces vulnerability. In other words, is it reducing the community's exposure to hazards? They assign a -1 for a negative effect or an increase in vulnerability as a result of policy implementation. In other words, is it increasing the community's exposure to hazards? And then a 0 indicates that the policy does not affect vulnerability in that planning district. So, like I say, this is a very involved process. I'm not even showing you the breakdown, the intermediate step before you get to the scorecard, but I think you get this idea of how it can work. And then if you look at the bottom summary row, you can see that the core land use plan and the comprehensive plan are not doing very well under either hazard. They've got that -38, -17. Maybe not surprisingly, the hazard mitigation plan comes out on top of the scores, which is an indication that the other plans may be well served by integrating the policies from this plan into their updates. The PERS GIS mapping allows for analysis of overlapping social and physical vulnerability. In this evaluation, the scored resiliency policies of the 4 plans that I just mentioned are shown in comparison with the 100-year floodplain. Moving clockwise from the upper left, the maps illustrate scores from the land use plan, the comprehensive plan, the parks and open space plan, and the hazard mitigation plan in the lower left. The darker the color, the more policies aimed at decreasing vulnerability. So these maps can be a very intuitive tool for communicating where the network of plans stand on the continuum of resiliency policies. A lot of color helps people understand concepts that maybe are not well communicated just in narrative. Using the scorecard and the mapping results, the PERS guidebook provides instruction for identifying physical and social vulnerability mismatches and ways to adjust plans based on this knowledge. This step requires additional data and mapping in many cases, but the scorecard results, if you just go through this process to the scorecard portion, it should help any community identify and help fix their resilience policies moving forward. Finally, the PERS process recommends looking for successful stories from other communities as a way to communicate the importance of changing your own community's network of plans to become more resilient. And that is something that we heard loud and clear when we were setting up this webinar series, is that people are hungry for stories of success, or maybe even ways to do things better. So I've given a very basic overview to this tool. I don't know if I've done it justice, but if you're interested in exploring it further, the PERS website provides many resources that you can explore. And as I mentioned, they are free. The next tool you may want to explore is found in FEMA's publication, Plan Integration Linking Local Planning Efforts. So this guide emphasizes a two-way exchange of information between hazard mitigation plans, both at the state and local level, and other community plans. And they do this in 2 primary ways. First, integrating natural hazard information and mitigation policies and principles into local planning mechanisms and vice versa. And this involves making sure there's information on natural hazards, identifying hazard-prone areas through the community, and developing those appropriate goals, objectives, policies, and projects. The second way that they recommend is encouraging collaborative planning and implementation and interagency coordination. So this includes involving key community officials, so elected officials, people with the authority to execute policies and programs to reduce risk, and then collaborating across departments and agencies with key staff to keep that communication, share knowledge, and build relationships that are important to implementation. The guide is divided into 3 sections that focus on integration of hazard mitigation principles into comprehensive plans and other local planning mechanisms, as well as that integration across agencies. Like the PERS evaluation, it assumes that a team of staff will oversee the process of creating that inventory. For each section, the guide provides a series of questions that cover land use, transportation and infrastructure, emergency management, environment, and open space and plan implementation. That's environment and open space and plan implementation. So some examples of the questions include, does your community's future land use map take into account natural or human-caused high hazard areas? Does the long-range transportation plan address hazards that can occur and affect the transportation system assets? Does your community stormwater management plan address low-income development techniques to manage stormwater? If the answer to the question is no, this indicates a gap. Recommendations for addressing these gaps are provided by examples and best practices for each of the sections. The guide also includes case studies and a list of resources. After completing all three sections, the next recommended step is to create a plan integration document that includes the results of the analysis, and that document can be included in your next hazard mitigation plan or as an appendix to the current one. I mentioned the Land Information Access Association. They've received a number of grants from the Michigan Coastal Management Program to support coastal community planning efforts on resilience. Their Resilient Michigan project has now assisted over 20 municipalities in creating sustainability plans or chapters for their master plans. The first step in the Resilient Michigan process is to work with local officials to inventory their current plans, policies, and codes using their LEA's Community Sustainability Assessment tool. So that should sound very familiar. That first step is inventory and pulling together a team. The tool is a simple Excel spreadsheet that can be adapted to a community's particular needs. It can be downloaded for free from the Resilient Michigan website. Ideally, the checklist, excuse me, is supplemented by a series of GIS maps that identify vulnerable areas and populations within the community. The sustainability checklist covers 4 categories of sustainability concerns: economic, social, environmental, and there's a separate coastal section. Here is an example from on this slide of the coastal category. The left column lists benchmarks for the community to consider, and the right column provides some additional description about the benchmark. In the self-assessment, the review team notes Y for yes, if the benchmark is found in the network of plans, I if it's found but needs improvement, and N no if not in place. So the combination of the completed self-assessment and the vulnerability maps provides the community with a starting point to explore changes to their plans and codes to incorporate these resiliency policies and actions. Next up, the Michigan Economic Development Corporation recently released their Resiliency Toolkit as a part of the Redevelopment Ready Communities program. This toolkit is geared toward local officials and staff as a way to integrate resiliency into already adopted plans. Given MEDC's mission, this tool includes more about economic resilience than the other tools. Similar to the other tools, however, the guide recommends doing a self-assessment, what is price, as a first step in determining where the community is on the continuum of resilience planning. But rather than focusing on a structured plan inventory, they recommend a more nuanced effort to assess a baseline of readiness in 4 areas: place, people, infrastructure, and economy. For step 1, which is ready and repair, the RRC has developed an online survey to evaluate local awareness and capacity in order to identify gaps in understanding the shared vision. The City of Marquette recently went through the RRC self-assessment process with the help of an RRC technical assistance consultant, and they created a very comprehensive resiliency assessment. On the right side of this slide is an excerpt from that document showing the various state, county, and city climate plans that inform the assessment, which is a really nice line of sight illustration, even if you can't read it very well because of the gray text on the screen. I will point out that this process created a separate document, although the assessment is being consulted as part of Marquette's current master plan update process, so there is going to be that linkage. Finally, I'd like to share an example from personal experience. When I worked at the City of Ann Arbor, we wanted to bring sustainability goals to the top of our unwieldy network of, yes, 20 plans, rather than try to integrate them into existing documents. We secured a foundation grant to create an overarching plan or an umbrella plan or a framework, however you want to call it, to guide city policy. The process was similar to the other tools in that we formed an internal staff working group to inventory our plans. We went through a process to identify common themes in the plans, a process we called goal bunching, very technical. And that was a way to identify these overarching goals, which we called big, hairy goals. Ultimately, the effort grouped 200 plus city goals from 20 plus plans into 4 planning areas that you see here: climate and energy, community, land use and access, and resource management. From those 20 plus city goals, we created 16 sustainability goals, and then we reviewed each to ensure that the goals identified in the adopted plans were captured in this bunched sustainability goal. After this process, the framework was shared at 4 public forums and 6 boards and commission meetings to make refinements, and it was ultimately adopted by the Planning Commission and City Council as the policy element of our master plan. I will note, though, that that was 10 years ago, and so now the city is embarking on a new comprehensive plan update. So we'll see how much of that gets woven into the work moving forward. Most of the techniques I just reviewed are usually guided by staff or a consultant, which is a great, efficient way to do things. But just like creating the plans themselves, when you incorporate diverse points of view, whether that's from staff from a variety of agencies or different jurisdictions or a mix of community members, we can build trust in the process and support for implementing those resilience actions. For instance, economic resilience might be more top of mind to community members than environmental concerns. In this case, resilience may mean emergency transportation and shelter to a resident without access to a private vehicle during a flooding event. It might mean a setback variance for a property owner who wants to relocate a house because its foundation is being undermined by erosion. As you look to update your network of plans to include resilience, will impacted populations be involved in the plan you're trying to update? I've highlighted here a new tool from the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. Their new and improved Hazard Mitigation Plan guide outlines 4 pathways to update hazard plans based on your community's capacity and what it hopes to accomplish. In particular, I'd encourage you to explore the guide's emphasis on social equity. As the guide points out, people whose livelihoods depend upon the outcome of resilience efforts are best suited to lead them. I've included here on the slide an excerpt of some questions from the guide's beginner pathway that can be used as a starting point for facilitating this involvement. The guide also includes boilerplate text organized according to FEMA's hazard mitigation plan requirements to streamline the process of incorporating social, ecological, and climate considerations into your hazard mitigation plans. So looking through these tools, a few observations for you to consider. Plan integration is not a solo activity. It's important to incorporate different perspectives, non-traditional participants, and underrepresented groups in the effort. Also, maps can help focus attention on physical and social vulnerabilities. If you don't have access to GIS, explore whether your regional planning organization or county can help with that. Plan integration and alignment can be a really big task. Think about starting off small by testing your plan and code alignment against a new development project, for instance, to build awareness and start the ball rolling. Think before creating another plan. You saw, there's a large network of plans. You have a lot to work with already, so maybe you just consolidate plans or amend plans. You should find ways to break down internal and community silos. This is a really challenging issue that we could probably spend a whole webinar on, but that is really important to this process. And then again, integrate social equity into your evaluation and recommendations. While making sure your plans are integrated and consistent is super important, this is an academic exercise until the resilience actions that you've identified are carried out and evaluated. So Hillary Taylor will talk in a moment about some of the ways that Emmett County has used momentum from their planning efforts to make changes to their policies and codes, but I'll highlight a few approaches in the meantime that can be helpful. So we mentioned that a municipality has 2 main paths for implementation: ordinances and development standards for private property primarily, but can be applied to public property as well, and capital planning and budgeting for public investments. As a reminder, zoning is a local ordinance that regulates the uses and development of land through the identification of specific districts and building standards. So I am showing you here the language from the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act that authorizes municipalities to undertake this form of regulation. It's really interesting, and I hadn't realized this until I went back and looked at this, that the act actually allows for the regulation of land to avert or solve specific land use problems, calling out flooding and beach erosion. So there you have it. A key thing to remember about this form of local regulation is that the Michigan Planning Enabling Act allows local governments to zone if the regulation is based on a plan. That means your zoning regulations should be in alignment with the master plan. If not, they are they're open to legal challenge. Some zoning approaches that are used to address at-risk areas in coastal settings include added setbacks from the ordinary high water mark and from bluff edge. And I know Emmett County has done a lot of work on bluffs. Overlay districts for shoreline and floodplain. So this is where there is a base zoning and an overlay district identified by a map, for instance, of a floodplain, provides additional regulations in those zones. Plan unit developments are a really great way to have a win-win with a difference, with a developer proposal perhaps, and some added benefits to the community. So that's an opportunity for resilience as well. And then rezoning, just moving or changing zoning regulations for properties that are in harm's way. In addition to zoning, other local ordinances and standards are often applied during the development review process. So land divisions, you've got your site plan and your subdivision regulations, utility requirements. Maybe you have some environmental codes that talk about identifying trees and doing tree replacement and wetlands. So these regulations can support resilience objectives. For instance, septic system regulations that require a point of sale inspection or street designs that limit the amount of impervious surface, but they need to be incorporated into your alignment with the master plan and the zoning ordinance as well. Recall that the capital improvements plan is where a community can prioritize and fund infrastructure projects. So does the capital improvement program provide funding for hazard mitigation projects that are identified in that plan? Does it include resiliency elements and infrastructure renovation or replacement? Let's say your wastewater treatment plant needs to be renovated. What can be incorporated to make it more resilient? Well, the University of Maryland's Environmental Finance Center has a publication that outlines best practices for making sure resilience is incorporated in the CIP. We've been talking about the ways to accomplish the first two practices, so integration and alignment. In addition, CIP review processes can be improved by adding climate resilience as a CIP project scoring criteria, using the CIP review process to encourage that cross-departmental collaboration, and requiring vulnerability assessments for proposed projects. Since Michigan law requires annual CIP updates, think about adding these practices incrementally to your process. Adding resilience criteria to the traditional CIP project scoring process can elevate its importance in the review. So on the left of this slide are some of the traditional scoring criteria used to evaluate proposed projects. So health, safety, welfare, long-term needs of the community. The last bullet is pretty general, but it can be adapted to fit your community's needs. Perhaps it reduces risk of damage to the asset. So think about how resiliency can be incorporated into those criteria. On the right side is a sample score sheet template from the Redevelopment Ready Communities Capital Improvements Guide that can be helpful in the scoring process. Here are some ideas to keep implementation of resilience initiatives at top of mind. So a plan integration column in the master plan implementation table would be really helpful because you can refer back to that. The resilience scoring rubric for CIP projects that I just mentioned. Incorporate updates on resilience recommendations in staff reports to the Planning Commission or the elected body. This can be as a part of a site plan, or it can be just a general standalone report. Empower an implementation advisory group. So a couple of the plans that I have worked on in the past, we were able to recruit some members from the Citizen Steering Committee when the plan was completed to meet annually to review implementation of the plan recommendations and then report to the Planning Commission. So that may be one way to keep things at top of mind. You can add a section to the Planning Commission annual report about implementation of resilience recommendations, and that will go on to the elected body. You can take advantage of community-wide surveys to ask residents about their resilience concerns. And then, of course, as mentioned earlier, collect and share stories to keep these in the public realm. As a final observation, the alignment between your zoning, CIP, and the master plan provides a backbone for your resilience efforts. If your zoning ordinance and zoning outcomes and infrastructure investments don't provide a line of sight to your master plan, and vice versa, this can erode the credibility both of your implementation efforts and your planning policies. You can keep tabs on alignment by formalizing an annual review of some common planning practices. So the master plan implementation table I just mentioned, you can analyze whether capital projects with high resilience scores are being funded or not. You can explore the reasons behind rezoning requests that might be contrary to the future land use plan to see what's behind that. You can explore the pattern of ZBA variance approvals to see if maybe the zoning ordinance needs to be revised because of that. And then you can monitor public support or opposition to resilience efforts and initiatives as a way to be smart about moving the ball forward with future plans. So with that, it's a lot of content. Thanks for sticking with me. We now have Hillary Taylor, who's going to share with us some ideas and some actual experience from Emmett County.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. That was really an excellent presentation. I took a lot of notes. So as Leah mentioned, I work for Emmett County. I'm up here in the north. And in 2020, we were part of a pilot program, grant funded by Eagle and coordinated by MAP, called the Coastal Leadership Academy. I was not here for that, so I can't tell you a whole lot about it. If you have questions about the Coastal Leadership Academy, Wendy can probably field those. But as part of that, the Leah from Traverse City did a resiliency evaluation and to determine different levels of threat that the Great Lakes have on Emmett County. And this resulted in an evaluation for the master plan in about 2020 as well. Because of our work with the Coastal Leadership Academy and the Leah study, we incorporated resiliency into the master plan with its own chapter. And this was chapter 8 of our master plan. We were compelled by the chapter in the master plan. The master plan goes from 2021 through 2025 to apply for a grant on coastal resiliency. As part of this grant we received from Eagle and NOAA, we are working with Beckett and Rader to determine what parts of our zoning ordinance should be updated to reflect what we have found as part of our resiliency evaluation and master plan conversations. We plan to prepare materials as part of this grant to send to each Lake Michigan shoreline property owner this year. We plan to use a web page to keep our mailing costs down, and because a web page can offer a more interactive educational experience. As Wendy mentioned, economic resiliency is a component that we have to consider. Our master plan recommends improved local productions of goods and supplies. We recently revised our zoning ordinance to allow to update all the allowed uses in the land use matrix. We had about 6 pages in our land use matrix, and we reduced it down to about 4 to really refine and bring up to speed the land uses in the matrix. And that should allow for better analysis of how to support local production. We do have limited staff and limited time to be updating our zoning ordinance, which needed a large overhaul to clean up dead wood in 2022 through 2023. The main place of resiliency for us is the coast of Lake Michigan. The shoreline is a source of recreation, wildlife habitat, scenic resources, and changing water levels. The climate will likely continue to warm, resulting in more flooding events with a risk of erosion. This may result in zoning ordinance amendments, but there are certain items that are already covered that we're aware of in terms of the fact that wetlands are regulated waters in the U.S. are already protected by the state, as are critical dunes. We do, as Wendy mentioned, we have a shoreline bluff protection ordinance, which is pretty current. Setbacks are required from the ordinary high water mark. I know that at the state level, we are working on a septic time of sale inspection. So that's something at the state level. But we are working with Beckett and Rader to determine what parts of the zoning ordinance should be updated. I took a couple of notes while Wendy was talking about, things that we might work on. Several of the documents that she referred to, our communities just simply does not have. But in terms of relocating at-risk roads, or we have some multi-way pathways that have eroded over time. And so there might be some way to look at those in terms of resiliency, floodplains, working to bring those into the master plan in terms of resiliency options.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. Well, let's see. We'll bring Wendy back here. And there we go.
Oh,
I see both of you now.
I think the spotlight needs to go back on Hillary, so.
Did I lose Hillary? Oh, here we go.
Yay, here we are.
Hooray. Okay. Well, it is the time to ask those questions and those comments. I don't see any in the chat yet, but please feel free to drop them in there. I'll start with a couple of questions. I'll ask Wendy. So you mentioned like a lot of ways to pull together those plans, and I wonder, if you're a community considering those ways, what are some things that you would think about? You mentioned capacity, you mentioned thoroughness. Are there other differences that stood out?
Well, certainly the mapping, as I mentioned, a number of communities do not have staff, they do not have mapping capabilities, although there are QGIS is a free program, but it also takes some knowledge in order to use. So really trying to look outward for resources, whether that's a regional planning agency. I know in the Keweenaw County that the West UP Planning and Development Region really helped those communities visualize hazards and walk through this process. So, those regional planning agencies can be helpful. And then in terms of staff, maybe you recruit the planning commission to do this, and maybe it's an exercise for your planning commission to become more familiar with the documents, is put them to work and say, okay, you're assigned this document, you find these elements, and, we'll combine them all together. It doesn't have to be onerous. It can be maybe just a section of your plans. So again, that start small is, try not to make this an overwhelming task, but there is value to going through this process.
Sure. We have in our coastal leadership academies, that's just reminded me that we have asked folks to look in their plans for, resiliency related things and called it a scavenger hunt in order to make it funner. So maybe that's, if you're going to dish out plans to your planning commission, maybe it could be, sort of spoken about in that sort of adventuresome way. Yeah. Hillary, well, actually, let me ask the folks who are in the chat. It doesn't have to just be questions, but I'd be curious to know in your communities, what kind of efforts have you gone through to pull this together? Maybe it's a couple of plans, maybe you've realized, oh gosh, we really need to get our park and rec plan in alignment with the comp plan, but haven't branched out to the county hazard mitigation plan. Or I'd just be interested to know the various approaches that communities are taking to, know for the left hand to know what the right hand is doing, basically. So if you want to drop those in the chat, that would be great. Hillary, I wonder, so you talked a little bit about, and we talked a little bit before the webinar started about having arrived at a period when the plans have already been written, sort of midstream, pardon the pun here. And that happens, pretty often. Positions change, or you hire consultants to do some of the work, and kind of the plans have to stand for themselves. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that experience. Like, did you feel like what was in the plans in the study really gave you enough information to move forward? How you utilize that existing work?
Thanks, Leah. It's a good question. We have the whole chapter in the master plan, which is really helpful. But I was talking with Wendy and Leah before the webinar started, in that we have several other layering documents. Some don't exist at all, and some are out there. And I made a note to myself, for example, that hazard, parks, planning, and building should maybe get together and do some of this work in terms of the team, to start to figure out if there's conflict between the plans, and see if there, what the network of plans has to offer in terms of resiliency. But coming at it from midstream, I relied somewhat on the master plan, but also my coworkers.
Sure.
Yeah.
Did you, were these sort of integration tools new to you? And were there any that from your own, in your own little corner of the world thought, maybe I'm going to look into that one? Were there any that caught your eye for Emmett County particularly?
I wrote down notes about PERS, the Planning for Resiliency scorecard, and the FEMA one. I think those could be helpful. But, really the work that I think Wendy did in Ann Arbor 10 years ago could be really instrumental for us in terms of looking at, that diagram of environmental economy and equity, and try how you integrate those.
And you have even sort of more coordination and integration opportunities that from the county perspective, than because there's lots of municipalities in there. I wonder, could you talk a little bit about how that impacts, integration and alignment? Because it's not just county plans, right? There are individual municipalities to coordinate and all that stuff too.
Yeah, so we have a master plan, but the county has 20 townships. Of those 20 townships, 4 of those townships have decided to do their own planning. So we've got 16 townships under our jurisdiction. Of those, I don't know off the top of my head, but many of them do their own master plans. And so we have master plans at the township level, and then we have master plan at the county level. And then we have a hazard mitigation plan that's countywide. And we have a road commission, which sort of has its own budget and board of commissioners. And so integrating some of these pieces in terms of resiliency of some of the items I mentioned, in terms of the multi-way pathways that has eroded, some of our roads, things like that. It's a multi-layer sandwich to get that one to work. So it will take a team for sure.
Sure.
Imagine, with the 5-year update requirements from the parks plans and the hazard mitigation plans, that those are probably the best way to intervene if you're not going to start something brand new. Because at any given time, probably one of those plans may be up for review. So just, making sure the hazard mitigation plans are often done by, the sheriff or, the local emergency manager. And so making sure that they understand and know who you are and what your concerns are. And that might be a great relationship just to start right there with the hazard mitigation plans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we recently did the Parks and Rec master plan update, and I know that our master plan comes due. It expires in 2025, so we will be working on a new master plan in 2025. So the integration of those two pieces, I think, there's a lot of opportunity there. And the hazard mitigation plan is just being rewritten now with a grant with Networks Northwest.
So I'm just curious, for those that are still here on the webinar, have any of you used any of these tools? I know some of them are fairly new, like the RRC Resiliency Guide is pretty new, but some of you may have been involved actually in creating that. Just curious. And if you have, what your reactions are. Stunned silence.
I know. Which maybe doesn't surprise. I mean, it does not seem to me. So for the benefit of the audience, worked as a planning consultant before I came to MAP, and I feel like there was not a lot of emphasis or on formal plan integration. Like when you would start a project, you would try to do it, but boy, these tools do not feel to me like they're very widely used. And maybe the stunned silence is a corroboration of that. So that seems like a real opportunity. I actually, from both of you, from your different contexts, I wonder if you could speak to. So Wendy, you said in the beginning, like all these things start in the same thing, an inventory of the plans and pulling a team together. And I think, Hillary, a theme that I have heard, as you've talked about is sure, there's what gets written down in the alignment, but then there's also just the act of like, now we're talking to different folks. Like right now we have different people at our meetings than we did. And I wonder, probably a percentage is like you can't pin it down that far, but I wonder how much of this effort, how much of the benefit of this effort comes from like the things that we actually adapt and write down, and how much of it is just from like kind of getting the circulation going, the communication, just having a structure by which people need to connect over.
Yeah, oh, go ahead, Hillary.
No, go ahead, Wendy.
Excuse me. So actually, as I was looking at the Maryland CIP document, they had an example from Ann Arbor. So I guess we were doing it okay if we were cited. But that was a pretty intensive process when I was at the city, and I believe it still is. Interdisciplinary, so staff, you'd sit down with the field staff, you'd sit down with the engineers, you'd sit down with the the signal people, try to bring in folks from, the county drain commissioner when you're looking at that asset area. So if we were looking at stormwater, we'd bring all of these people together, and the field folks would say, hey, you think this is a great solution, but this retaining wall keeps falling down because of the springs underneath there. I mean, it's a very fine-grained type of information that you get from people who are out in the field. So, backing out here to talk about plan integration, just bringing people in who may be new observers and just say, this is crazy that you're recommending this, or why aren't you recommending that? There's a lot of benefit to that. And so maybe you use existing committees that you have in place. Maybe you have site plan review committees and, that bring together different departments, the building official, whatever, and, task them or just give them an exercise and doing this as a starting point. But yeah, that communication across silos is really important.
Yeah. Hillary?
I'm sorry, I just am noticing there's a really good note in the chat.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Probably get to. Yeah, I think to piggyback on what Wendy said, the team I think will be really important for us moving forward. I think, the first step is really for us just to acknowledge that we have these plans and the plans really don't necessarily talk to each other. And then that could be a problem for our community, particularly when you look at like the hazard mitigation plan, the Parks and Rec plan, the comprehensive master plan, and what we're doing at the building level. When you stack those plans on each other, I really do think that the point of this presentation is that they really do need to talk to each other.
Yeah.
Have some coordination.
Okay, that comment. I lived in a Western Michigan Lakeshore community during the pandemic, served as a planning commissioner. I wish local officials had the interest and willingness to use these tools. In my admittedly limited experience, priorities were driven by short-term concerns and dependence on tourism, which in some contexts was at odds with resilience.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I'll ask Wendy
Yeah.
to talk a little more about that.
Well, you can blend these together as long as you communicate that the impacts, for instance, to the shoreline are going to impact tourism. Your golden goose that you're bringing people into the community, the beach, the lakeshore, whatever, if it's impacted, then people will go away. So, trying to figure out what those connections are to the short-term concerns that will make people think about, okay, maybe we should spend some time thinking about this. But you're right. People, they think about economics, they think about things that are going to affect them individually, and that can be a real challenge. But keep at it.
Right. I mean, that seems to be like the headline challenge of planning is trying to pry the perspective away from the short term and onto the long term, right? Away from the narrow and onto the that's what we do, isn't it? So thank you, Linda, for fighting the good fight. We
Thanks,
appreciate
Linda.
it. Hillary, if you wanted to add anything to that.
No, I just sorry, I'm noticing what's in the chat.
Sure.
I'm distracted. Yeah.
Back to the next one then. Okay, we'll catch up with you here. So
Mhm.
the next one actually is focused on Emmett County, right? As a planner with Networks Northwest, I'm working on updating the Emmett County 2016 Hazard Mitigation Plan, reviewing local plans for goals and objectives that align with hazard mitigation strategies, which is one of the many new review requirements that FEMA looks for in current hazard mitigation plans. So FEMA's on board. Great.
So Stephanie, be curious to know, since you're doing and using this FEMA tool, does it seem like overly involved, or is it helpful in going through the process? And you can unmute yourself if you'd like.
Yeah, we'd love that.
Yeah. Oh, sure. It, well, they have a very long checklist of what's required in the plan, and I wouldn't say I'm probably doing more of an overkill possibly than what they're requiring, but I'd rather overshoot than undershoot, if you know what I mean. But it also just makes sense to me. Like, what's the purpose of this plan if it can't be implemented at a local level, you know? So that's kind of what I'm trying to achieve with the update here. When you make the mitigation strategies, they have to be realistic and achievable. And so if they align with local planning efforts that have already been stated in a plan, that seems to make a lot of sense. So that's what one of the things I'm trying to outline. But I actually have not reviewed that one tool you provided, the FEMA plan integration.
Oh, okay.
I noticed it was from 2015, but
I think it probably was a precursor to what you're using right now.
Yeah, okay. But no, I actually haven't looked at it yet.
Okay, well, now you've got the link. And
Yeah.
I would, like I say, I would highly recommend the USDN new and improved hazard mitigation.
Yeah.
It really pushes you to think about, the social equity piece, which we talk about a lot, but we don't necessarily deal with the hard questions of, low income people live in floodplains, so how do
Right.
we address that? You know, heat impacts, affect people that don't have air conditioning, seniors
Yeah.
don't drive. So these are things that we talk about, but sometimes, it's more of just like, oh, we're just documenting it, but we're not really moving the needle in terms of trying to assist with that.
Right. If I could just add that, so FEMA now looks for evidence of vulnerable communities, like you've done your homework to identify those folks. So, for us, it's, population over age 65, people live in really remote areas up here too. What kind of services are available to seniors? And then so they do want us to get more into the demographics than we ever have before with these plans. So looking at social equity.
That's great, Stephanie. So good luck to you on that. I would say the one thing that I did not include in any of the presentation today is the overlap with health planning. And the health world is kind of a whole different group with different jargon and whatever, but there are opportunities to overlap with them on physical activity goals, but also things like epidemiology and worrying about, mosquito populations and the impact on health. And so, I mean, you really could go far afield in some of these hazard plans.
Yeah,
But there are things that we need to be thinking about.
sure.
Stephanie, can I ask you a follow-up question?
Sure.
I love that you are looking for goals and objectives that align with the hazard mitigation strategies. And since I just learned from Wendy 30 minutes ago that your goals and objectives can conflict with hazard mitigation strategies, I wonder if you were seeing any of those and or noting them.
Hmm.
Maybe you just learned from Wendy 30 minutes ago also.
I can't really think of anything off the top of my head. I think I'm more looking for where they align versus actually where they conflict, to be
Yeah.
honest. Yeah. So,
Which makes a lot of sense, just
yeah,
the authority that a hazard mitigation plan has, which is not
right. And
authority.
ultimately it is the local government's responsibility to take this plan and apply it to their own planning efforts in the future. So we kind of put the onus on them, you know.
Sure.
So,
There's a hierarchy,
Yeah.
truly. So,
right.
any other observations from the rest of you? I hope this has been helpful in terms of tools that you might want to explore. We will follow up with an email to you all if you have been on this webinar that includes the links so that you can go back and explore them later. Anything else, Hillary, that you want to add, or Leah?
I don't think so. I'm putting a link to the evaluation in the chat right now so that you can let us know what you found helpful here, what topics you would like to know more about, how everything went. So if you could fill that out, we would really appreciate it. And then I'm just going to launch this poll one more time, but still be thinking, if you have another comment, we still got another 12 minutes. We're happy to chat about it. I'm going to launch this poll one more time in case you missed it as you were still coming in, which is our ask for permission to use your time as part of the match here, giving permission to the Michigan Association of Planning to apply my time participating in this webinar toward the volunteer match requirement. MAP will use the Zoom participant report to document the match. If you have already answered this question or you are a federal employee, you don't have to take this poll. So I will just leave that up on your screen. You can take it and then you don't have to do anything more with it. There's a question, will you be sending out the presentation? Wendy, do we send a link to the recording, right, with your follow-up email?
So the recording will be on the webinar, or excuse me, the webinar page on our brand new website at MAP. So you'll be able to access that next week. The presentation itself, I think the last time I sent out the PDF of the PowerPoint, so I can continue to do that and also include the links in the body of the email. So if you registered and you're on here, we'll have your email and we can send that out to you next week.
Great. Well, I don't see any additional comments or questions here in the chat. So with that, we can, if any final thoughts?
No, I thank you, Wendy, for a great presentation. I think this is something that we'll have to look at in terms of the integration of our plans. So that's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, no pressure, just ideas,
Yeah.
right? Do the best you can. Great. Thank you all for being here.
Yes, this is terrific. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.
No, it looks like Leah's gone. So, very nice.